The year was 1908, and the small Kentucky Valley lay nestled between soft green ridges where fog hugged the trees like secrets. Life was simple there: coal miners, farmers, a small chapel, and one proud structure that stood as the heart of the community: Maple Hollow Schoolhouse. Built from oak timbers and stone hauled by mules, it sat on a gentle hill above the creek. Every morning the sound of the school bell, a clear, silvery tone, rolled across the valley, calling children from the fields and porches. But one night in early November, that familiar sound was replaced by something else: smoke, then flame. By the time the townsfolk reached the school, the roof was a furnace. The air smelled of pine and sorrow. Buckets of water did nothing. Someone screamed that the children were still inside. Mothers cried. Fathers beat the walls with axes, desperate. But by dawn, the schoolhouse was nothing but a charred skeleton, its bell cracked and silent atop the ruin. For days, the valley fell quiet. Even the birds seemed to grieve. Until, a week later, the bell began to ring again. Clara May Whitfield was a teacher with a gentle heart and a stubborn faith in children. At 28, she had a gift for reaching those others had given up on. She taught with stories, songs, and kindness. That night of the fire, Clara wasn't there. Her mother had fallen sick in a nearby town, and she'd left her assistant, young Miss Dory, in charge. When Clara returned days later, she saw only ashes. The valley's pastor met her at the bridge. "We found 7 bodies, Clara," he said softly, "all children." Clara fell to her knees beside the smoldering ruins. She touched the blackened earth where her desk once stood. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I was supposed to be here." Then she heard it, the faint sound of metal clanging in the distance. She froze. It was the school bell. 3 slow tolls. Everyone said the bell rope had burned away. But that night, it rang again, clear, measured, and haunting. At first, the villagers blamed the wind. "Metal expands," said the blacksmith. "It's just the wind in the frame." But that didn't explain how it always happened at dusk. Never sooner, never later. Every evening as the sun slipped behind the ridge, the bell rang 3 times, then fell silent. Old Mr. Tanner, who lived up the road, swore he saw children's shadows playing near the ruins, running, skipping, chasing something unseen. A few others said they heard faint laughter echoing from the trees. By the 3rd week, people had begun crossing themselves when they passed the site. They called it the Bell of Maple Hollow, but Clara, she didn't fear it. She was a teacher, and where others saw ghosts, she saw unfinished lessons. 7 small graves lined the hill behind the church. Each had a wooden cross carved by grieving fathers, names scrawled by hand: Tommy, Ruthie, Sarah, Eli, Ben, Carrie, and June. Every Sunday Clara visited, laying wildflowers she gathered from the meadows. She read aloud to them, the lessons she would have taught that week. In her journal, she wrote, "If their souls linger, may they find comfort in knowing their teacher still remembers." And every time she stood there, the wind shifted softly, as though someone brushed against her shoulder. And that night, as always, the bell rang again. But something changed. The 3rd toll lingered longer, like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Sheriff Amos Dillard wasn't a man who liked mysteries. He'd served in the Spanish-American War and believed in things you could see and touch. When people began whispering about the bell, he decided to prove it was nonsense. One evening, he rode out to the ruins just before sunset. The air smelled of old smoke and wet leaves. The bell stood blackened but intact. Its rope had burned to a brittle stump weeks ago. He examined it carefully. Then he waited. As the last light faded, the bell swung once, then again. Amos's eyes widened. There was no wind. The charred rope was moving on its own. He grabbed it, warm to the touch, too warm. When he pulled, the bell rang once more, a sound so pure it sent shivers down his spine. He dropped the rope and backed away. The next morning, he told no one what he'd seen. But at dusk, the bell rang louder than ever before. Clara began sleeping near the ruins. She couldn't explain why. She just felt the children were waiting. She brought a small tent, her chalkboard, and her teaching books. Every evening when the bell began to stir, she stood before the ruins and spoke as if her pupils were still seated on the wooden benches that no longer existed. "Good evening, children," she'd begin softly. "Tonight we'll talk about courage and what it means to do what's right, even when you're afraid." Sometimes she swore she heard whispers answering her, like faint giggles or the rustle of skirts. And each time she finished her lesson, the bell would ring once, clear and soft, as if in gratitude. The villagers watched from a distance, whispering that Clara had lost her mind. But some evenings, when the light hit just right, even the doubters felt it, a warmth that wasn't there before. Late one afternoon, as Clara was packing her books, she noticed a man by the tree line, tall, lean, with soot-stained hands and a hollow look in his eyes. He introduced himself as Elias Boone, a drifter passing through. His voice was low, almost shy. "That the old schoolhouse that burned?" he asked. When Clara nodded, his gaze fell. "Heard stories of a bell that won't stop ringing. Folks say it calls to the guilty." She frowned. "To the guilty?" He nodded. "I've been around fires. I know what smoke remembers." Before she could ask what he meant, he tipped his hat and walked away. But as he passed the old bell, it gave a single, faint chime. Though, no, one had touched it. That night, Clara wrote in her journal, "The bell knows more than it tells." As winter crept into the valley, something new joined the ringing of the bell. At first, Clara thought it was the wind whistling through hollow logs, but soon she realized it was a melody, a soft tune. It was the morning song her students used to sing, "Bright morning stars arising, day is a-breaking in my soul." The first night she heard it, she fell to her knees. The voices were faint but unmistakable. 7 children, singing in harmony. The next day, Mrs. Elkins, mother of little Ruthie, came to the ruins and stood in silence. When the song began again that evening, she wept and whispered, "That's my baby's voice." From that night on, the entire valley gathered near the ruins to listen. Some said the children were thanking their teacher. Others believed they were asking to be freed. For Clara, it was neither. It was a lesson in forgiveness, a melody of love that had survived the fire. As the months passed, a darker rumor began to spread. What if the fire hadn't been an accident? Old miners in the tavern whispered that someone had seen a lantern fall near the school porch that night, a figure running away in the smoke. Sheriff Amos decided to reopen the case. Sifting through the ashes again, he found something he hadn't noticed before, a bent piece of metal half buried in the dirt. It was part of a coal oil lamp. He showed it to Clara. She frowned. "That isn't mine. I never used that kind in the schoolhouse." Then she remembered Elias Boone, the stranger with the burned hands, the man who'd said, "I've been around fires." Her heart sank. Could it be? Clara found Elias near the river, working with a small crew chopping timber. His hands were blistered and scarred, his eyes heavy with sleepless nights. When she approached, he dropped his axe and stood still, as if expecting judgment. "I know about the lamp," she said quietly. He didn't deny it. His voice broke as he spoke. "I was there that night, Miss Whitfield. I was fixing the roof beam after hours. My lantern slipped, hit a curtain. The fire spread too fast. I tried to save them. God knows I did. But the heat—" He stopped, shaking. "I heard them crying, and I ran. I've been running ever since." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but not from anger. She placed a trembling hand on his arm. "You didn't mean to." He shook his head, meaning, "Don't matter. I took their lives." Clara looked toward the hills, where the sun was beginning to dip. "Then maybe the bell rings for you," she said softly. "Maybe they're not calling for vengeance, Elias. Maybe they're calling you home." For the first time he lifted his head. His eyes met hers, haunted, but hopeful. "I want to make it right," he whispered. "Then come with me," Clara said. "We'll go where the bell still rings." And as they walked back toward the ruins together, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, tender sound of the children's song. That evening, under a bruised purple sky, Clara and Elias returned to the old school site together. The air was thick with the smell of pine smoke, though no fire burned. Elias walked ahead, trembling. His boots crunched over the ashes where he'd once stood frozen in terror. He knelt, running his blackened fingers through the earth. "I remember where each desk was," he whispered. "Sarah sat here, Tommy by the window. They trusted me." His voice cracked. "I failed them." Clara knelt beside him. "You tried. Sometimes trying isn't enough, but repentance can be." As if in response, the bell above them began to sway, its rusted frame groaning. Then, for the first time, it rang not in sorrow, but in strength, a long, rich sound that filled the whole valley. Then came the laughter, soft, sweet, like the rustle of children running through tall grass. Elias gasped, looking up through tears. "Do you hear them?" Clara smiled faintly. "Yes, they forgive you." And as the last tone faded, the two of them stood hand in hand, surrounded by a peace that neither could explain. Elias stayed in the valley after that night. No one asked him to, but no one sent him away either. He built fences, repaired barns, and fixed doors for families who couldn't pay. At first, folks watched from a distance, unsure what to think of a man marked by guilt. But they saw how he worked through storms, how he carried firewood to widows' porches at dawn, how he placed flowers on the 7 graves every Sunday. Forgiveness, the valley learned, wasn't just a word. It was a labor, quiet and steady. Each evening the bell still rang at dusk, but now its sound brought calm, not fear. The children in town would pause in their chores to listen, hands folded, eyes lifted toward the hill. They said it sounded like hope finding its way home. Months later, Clara received an envelope sealed with the State Board of Education's insignia. Inside was a letter from the superintendent himself. He had heard the story of Maple Hollow's tragedy and of Clara's courage in continuing her lessons amid loss. The state wished to help rebuild the school, making it one of the first brick schoolhouses in the region. But there was one request. If the bell still stands, let it hang again. May its voice guide a new generation. The townsfolk hesitated. The bell had become sacred, a relic of sorrow and mystery. But Clara rose during the town meeting and said gently, "It once rang for learning, then for loss. Now let it ring for life again." The people nodded through tears. The decision was made. By late autumn, the new school stood proudly on the same hill, sturdy red brick, white shutters, tall glass windows, a new chapter for the valley. On opening day, the entire community gathered. Clara, now appointed head teacher, wore her best shawl and held the polished bell rope in her hand. Before she rang it, she looked toward the old ruins, where wildflowers had begun to bloom among the ashes. She whispered, "This is for you, my darlings." She pulled the rope. Ding, dong, ding. The sound was bright, pure, full of sunlight, and though no one else seemed to notice, Clara heard it. another bell answering faintly from the woods far beyond the hill, as if 7 small hands were ringing along in joy. Winter came swiftly. Snow powdered the roofs, and smoke curled from chimneys like quiet prayers. Elias, who had labored endlessly for months, fell ill, a fever that took his strength fast. Clara visited him daily in the small cabin by the river. He smiled faintly, his skin pale as paper. "I can't stay much longer," he whispered, "but don't mourn me. I'll be with the children. You'll hear me in the bell." Clara squeezed his hand, tears slipping down her face. "You already found your redemption, Elias," he smiled weakly. "No, you gave it to me." The night he passed, a snowstorm swept through the valley. As the wind howled, the bell rang 3 times, clear, strong, and strangely joyful. The next morning, it was silent. The bell never rang again. Spring returned, gentle and green. The valley thawed, and the air filled with birdsong. One morning, children playing near the old ruins came running to town, shouting for Clara. When she arrived, she saw it. Tiny footprints pressed into the soft earth. 7 sets, perfectly clear. They led from the blackened stones of the old school straight up the hill, to the front door of the new one. The prints ended there, just before the steps. Clara stood silently for a long time, her hand on her heart. "They've gone to class again," she whispered. That night, she dreamed of her students sitting neatly in rows, their faces glowing like sunlight. Elias stood at the door, ringing the bell, smiling. When she awoke, she was crying, but her tears were warm. Years passed, the valley changed. Children grew, families moved, roads were built. But Maple Hollow School remained. Clara grew older, her hair turning silver, her voice still soft and patient. Generations of children learned under her care, their laughter filling the same hills that once echoed with sorrow. At every graduation, the new principal would invite her to ring the old bell, still hanging proudly above the doorway. She'd smile, pull the rope, and the valley would fill with that same familiar tone. People said it sounded like more than metal. It sounded like forgiveness made eternal. In 1932, decades after the fire, a traveler from Ohio stopped in the valley. He was a writer, collecting ghost tales from the Appalachian region. He found the Maple Hollow School and asked the young teacher about the 2 bells hanging there, one new, one old and cracked. "That one," she said, pointing to the blackened one, "doesn't ring anymore, but we keep it as a reminder. It once saved this valley." That night, as the traveler camped by the creek, he heard it, the faint toll of a bell, 3 slow chimes drifting across the dark. The next morning, when he told the locals, they smiled knowingly. "You're not the first to hear it," said an old woman. "Only the ones with restless hearts do." He left Kentucky with tears in his eyes and a new story to tell. In 1955, workers renovating the school foundation found a small tin box, rusted but sealed tight. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a letter, written in Clara May Whitfield's delicate hand. It read, "To whoever finds this, know that sound carries memory. The bell you hear does not belong to sorrow, but to remembrance. It rings for those who gave love and for those who learned to forgive. If you ever hear it again, do not fear. It only means that somewhere kindness has been remembered." Clara May Whitfield, teacher of Maple Hollow School, 1908–1918. The workers fell silent. One of them swore he heard a soft chime from the rafters above, though no rope hung there anymore. Today, more than a century later, the old Maple Hollow clearing lies quiet, overgrown with ivy, wild daisies, and thyme. The brick school closed long ago, but the bell still hangs in a small museum nearby. Locals say that on still evenings, When mist rolls down from the mountains and the valley grows hushed, you can sometimes hear a faint bell ringing far away. 3 soft tolls, followed by laughter. Some say it's the sound of old metal shifting in the breeze. Others say it's the echo of Clara calling her class to order once more, with Elias by her side. Whatever it is, those who hear it walk away, changed, calmer, gentler, their hearts full of something they can't quite name. Because in that quiet valley the lesson never ended, and the bell of Maple Hollow still rings, not for the dead, but for the living who choose to remember.